Yes, let the witness take the declaration.
I solemnly declare that I will speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
If you'd like to take a seat.
Is your name Jerry Leiber? And as Leiber, were you a trained Soviet specialist, one of the founders of Helsinki Watch in 1979, and its first executive director from that year?
It is, and I am.
Did you stay in that position until 1995, when you retired from that position, but continuing your work and interest in the same human rights field?
I did.
You're an author of many articles and books. Helsinki Watch first started monitoring human rights in the former Yugoslavia in approximately what year?
1981.
At that time, or in the early stages, what was the principal focus of your interest in the former Yugoslavia?
You asked what was the
Yes,
principal?
what was the principal interest?
In 1981, that was our very first visits to the region. We were concerned mainly with political abuses of civil and political rights, and certain trials that were going on during the early 1980s of people who we felt were being repressed for expressing their opinions.
Was there, in those early years, any particular region of the former Yugoslavia that drew your attention more than others?
At that point, we were concerned, even then, with what was happening in Kosovo. We received reports. I didn't go to Kosovo that early, but in Belgrade, I received reports about the oppression of the Albanian minority in Kosovo. We were also concerned with a very strict situation in Croatia. I was warned not to go to Zagreb because I was told that I would not be allowed to stay there as a human rights investigator.
Let's move on then to a visit you made in August of 1999. And I think it was a visit you made along with another colleague, Kenneth Anderson, who was a lawyer.
Did you say 1990?
1990,
1990, yes.
And on that occasion with Mr. Anderson, did you visit Croatia, Kosovo, and also go to Belgrade?
Yes, we did.
The stimulus for that visit at that particular time being, in general, what?
At that point, there was the Federation was still together. There was talk, of course, of secession and of unrest. When we went first to Croatia and spoke there with political dissidents and intellectuals and human rights activists who took us to various villages, Serbian villages on the whole outside of Zagreb, where we saw for ourselves a situation of great anxiety, and I would actually call it hysteria. There had just before we came, there had been a referendum, an unofficial Serbian referendum, and there was talk, of course, of Croatia seceding from the Union, and the Serb minority was in a state of panic, generated, I think, by both sides, by the nationalist statements of President Tudjman, but also from the Serbian government, which was stirring up this unrest and feeling of panic that we witnessed firsthand.
How long did you spend there on this occasion?
Well, we were in three different republics. We were in Croatia we were in Croatia, in Kosovo, and in Belgrade, 2 republics. And altogether, I can't tell you exactly, but I would say that the trip was probably between 10 days and 2 weeks.
Did you speak to individuals on all sides, Croats, Serbs, Kosovans, and so on?
We did.
Just dealing with one aspect of the Croatian police, did you form a view, as a result of what you observed, as to whether the Croatian police were or were not being provocative by intent towards Serb villagers?
There was no question but that the Serb minority in the villages that we visited had reason to be anxious. The Croatian police had gone to these police stations to disarm them, to take the reserve weapons out of the police stations. And although it was promoted as a general policy throughout the country, they seemed to be targeting villages where the population was ethnic Serbian. And some of the places where we went were barricaded. Villagers had chopped down trees to prevent access. We had to actually get out of our car and remove the trees in order to get in. They were terribly frightened. The Croatian police that I met in the 2 villages that I went to told me that they were under orders not to provoke any kind of violence or unrest, that they were supposed to be as peaceful as possible. On the other hand, their equipment seemed overly military for the job that they were sent there to do, and there was just the fact of their being there was provocative.
May the binder of exhibits be given a number, and we'll then proceed, if this is acceptable, by tab numbers within the exhibit.
That would be Prosecutor's Exhibit 359.
359. Your Honour, by oversight, I didn't prepare a spare bundle for the witness. If the usher would be good enough to take the court registrar's bundle and, with his usual skill, place the appropriate page on the overhead projector, we will then make a copy available to the witness, if she can follow it herself. If we can then turn to tab 1 of Exhibit 359 and lay the front page on the overhead projector. Ms. Labour, did you prepare in January 1991 a report based upon your investigation headed Human Rights in a Dissolving Yugoslavia?
Yes, I actually did not write this report. It was written by my colleague, but I edited and collaborated with him on it.
A few sentences, please, about the methodology of the preparation of this report and of the following report, to which we'll come in a few minutes.
Well, our methodology remains pretty stable throughout the organization. We send fact finders to the region. They acquire information by interviewing witnesses and victims of abuses, take detailed notes, compare them. We interview each witness individually and try to find corroborative evidence from other witnesses that tend to reinforce what we get from one, and as many as possible testifying to the same events. We also look into police records, hospital records, for any forensic information that's available, and of course we investigate the scenes of crimes whenever we can ourselves. Then it is compiled into a report which is edited, in which I, as the director, would then bring to the attention of the governments in question, to their embassies, to the press, and to anyone else that we feel would be effective in bringing these issues to world attention.
Two things before we look at this first report. This report, unlike the second one, you were actually a participant yourself. You were one of the officers preparing the raw material.
That's right.
Secondly, you've spoken already of reports being provided to the relevant embassies, I think, and governments. In this case, with this report, did it go to the governments and the embassies of the former Yugoslavia?
Yes, it did.
Obviously, I'm not going to go through this or any other report in detail. They're available for consideration by parties and by the Chamber in full in due course, and I'll just take us to a few particular points. The first page of the report is unnumbered, but if the usher could very kindly lay that on the projector. And at the foot of the first page, Ms. Labour, in the paragraph headed background, do we see it made clear in the last two lines that Helsinki Watch takes no position on whether Yugoslavia should or should not stay together as a country. Was that your position?
That was our position. That is always our position in any country we deal with. It is not within the mandate of our organization to take a position on the national boundaries of any country.
We can go now to page number, and they are now page number 3. And the foot of that page, do we see this passage reflecting part of your mission on that occasion to Kosovo? Treatment by the Serbian government of ethnic Albanians in the province of Kosovo, meanwhile, continues to worsen, resulting in one of the most severe situations of human rights abuse in Europe today. Just pausing there. This report was prepared, of course, before the conflicts in Croatia, Bosnia, and later Kosovo occurred. So we're looking back over them to an earlier time.
Well before, yes.
Was that your judgment, that the human rights position, the human rights abuse in Kosovo was one of the most severe in Europe at that time?
Yes, it was.
And in preparing your reports, generally, were you aware of, sensitive to, or responsive to other work by other human rights organizations working in the same area?
Yes, we were.
If you found your preliminary views out of line with, inconsistent with the views of others, would you have recorded it, responded to it in some way?
Yes, we would, of course.
You went on to say in this paragraph, ethnic Albanians in Kosovo are being arrested en masse, beaten, and in some instances tortured in prison and subject to mass firings from their jobs on account of ethnicity. Serbian police units, and we go to the next page, repeatedly use excessive force in confronting ethnic Albanian demonstrations, killing more than 50 people so far in 1990 alone. Was that, as you understood it, a correct reflection of the position?
That accurately reflects our findings.
Just to remind us, at that time, was there any existence of KLA or similar on the ground?
There was no KLA to my knowledge. In fact, one of the strongest impressions I came away from after that visit was how peaceful, how inexplicably peaceful the Albanian minority appeared to be. There was no talk of arms, there was no talk of even demonstrations or protests, as we might see somewhere else, given what was happening to them. They really seemed to be dependent at that juncture on world opinion coming to their rescue, and people like us, for people like us, it was a great responsibility to try to get that story out. No one was paying much attention at that point.
Staying now on page 4, and I'm going to deal with this passage in a little more detail than others, Your Honour, simply because it's not in the witness statement that I know you've had an opportunity to pre-read. Carrying on from where we were, do you say this? Security forces of the Serbian government, as discussed below, have attacked ethnic Albanian villages in apparent attempts at intimidation. The Serbian government has suspended the Kosovo parliament and other institutions of government in which ethnic Albanians participated, shut down for extended periods of time the main ethnic Albanian daily paper Reliendia, and taken all Albanian language programming off Kosovo television and radio. Has embarked on a program to disenfranchise and marginalise the ethnic Albanian population in ways constituting racism, impermissible ethnic discrimination, and a grave violation of the rights of ethnic Albanians to free expression and equal political participation. Was that your judgment, and on what material did you base it?
It was definitely our judgment. It was based on many interviews with journalists, members of the Albanian minority, professionals who had been fired from their jobs, doctors, others who explained to us that they were all out of work. There was a situation of apartheid, actually, in process there, where the entire Albanian population, which was not the minority in that case, but the majority, was being precluded from participating in civil society or in professional life. We also visited a village. Am I jumping ahead?
No, but, well, tell us about it, and then I'll eliminate it from later evidence.
Okay, we visited a village named Polat where there had been violence.
Yes.
A very small village that had been attacked with tanks in the wee hours of the morning. Hard to imagine, given the size of the village, that a tank could actually even enter. It was so small, and such an egregious use of heavy force. They started shelling the homes. 2 young men were killed in cold blood.
I am going to stop you.
Okay.
Not because it's not relevant, but because you can answer questions should the accused want to ask you about these matters, and it's set out in your report in writing later.
Okay.
In any event.
Ms. Labour,
Yes.
in terms of interviews you had at that time, could you help us? How many interviews could you remember?
I would have to approximate that because it was 10 years ago and I don't have those notes with me, but I would say that altogether probably 30 interviews in Kosovo.
Thank you.
Staying on page 4, if we can jump the next paragraph and the first sentence of the following paragraph, we pick it up as follows. As recently as September 1989, when a joint Helsinki Watch International Helsinki Federation mission visited Kosovo province, there was at the time some basis for the view that...
Excuse me, we're on page 4?
Page 4. It's the middle paragraph, and...
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I've got it.
My mistake for not checking that you were with us. There was some basis for the view that repression by the Serbian government against Albanians, who comprised some 90% of the province's population, was at least partly an attempt, albeit abusively carried out, to protect the Serb minority in the province, rather than simply an attempt to subjugate ethnic Albanian identity. Serb and other minorities had, in the view of Helsinki Watch and the IHF, suffered abuse in earlier years. A year later, however, in October 1990, there is no justification for any claim that the Serbian government's intervention in Kosovo aims more than marginally to protect the Serb minority. Now, that was the judgment you formed then. First of all, is it a judgment by which you stand today?
Yes, it is.
And was it built on the interviews and other inquiries you made in this mission, or was it more broadly based on other material coming to you from earlier missions and so on?
Well, we worked together with the International Helsinki Federation, which also sent a mission there previously. And so this was a composite of the impressions we got during this visit and also from other groups that had visited with whom we exchanged materials.
But we see from this passage that you and your colleague were alert to the problems facing the Serb minority and to the
Yes.
fact that they needed protection, or may.
Absolutely. There definitely were those problems, but the response seemed way out of proportion to the problems.
The second sentence of the following paragraph reads as follows: the Serbian government has therefore undertaken an ambitious program to resettle Serbs in Kosovo in order, in effect, to retake the province. This resettlement is being accomplished by a racist policy of displacing ethnic Albanians from government and so on. Was that your judgment at the time?
Yes, that was our judgment.
I'm going to deal with the rest of the report that's central to the issue of Croatia more briefly. But before I do, just at the foot of this same page, page 4, you set out how on September the 2nd of 1990, a delegation of the International Helsinki Federation went to Kosovo to examine conditions there. The delegation consisted of 4 citizens of Austria, Denmark, and Holland. If we go over to page 5, you set out how the delegation were detained overnight by Serbian secret police in a Pristina hotel. Members of the delegation were interrogated. One member was threatened with imprisonment. I'm summarizing. Their papers were seized. In the next paragraph, you set out diplomatic protests and non-governmental protests were harsh, but the Yugoslavia government took days even to acknowledge that the expulsion had taken place. And then this, subsequently revealing the increasing weakness of the Yugoslav federal government in relation to Serbian Republican government. The federal government took the view that the expulsion order could be revoked only by a competent court in the Republic of Serbia. After a month of negotiation, the expulsion orders and persona non gratis stamps were finally expunged. That observation about the comparative authority of Serbia and the federation, the federal government, was that something you judged at the time and since?
I think it did not come as a surprise. Even at that point, it was quite clear that the federal government was very weak, almost impotent in exercising its powers.
And if you wanted something done, to whom did you address yourself?
The government of Serbia.
Was that a minority view of yours, or in your experience was that a majority view of those in a similar position to yours?
I believe it was generally assumed that that was where the power was.
We then come to the passage that you refer to in your statement, the Serb minority in Croatia. You set out the history which, or the relevant recent history, which had to do with Croats seizing weapons from police stations or gathering weapons from police stations in a way that would create anxiety amongst those who were not the recipients of weapons, in particular the non-Croats. And then on page 6, please, the first fresh paragraph. You say this of the overall position. I'll omit the first sentence and move to the second. When Croatian police units arrived, generally late at night, in various towns to pick up the rifles and other munitions, they were met by Serb demonstrations. Serbs who'd suffered terribly at the hands of Croatian fascists during World War II apparently believed that the current arms seizures would put them at the mercy of the Croatian government, a fear that was compounded by the fact that the arms seizures initially were carried out by special Croat-only police units, apparently hastily assembled and trained, mainly in villages and towns that were predominantly Serb. The Serb minority thus saw the seizures as a targeted disarmament and not as a neutral move by the government on a general and non-ethnic basis to reduce the quantity of arms that might otherwise fall into private hands and present a threat to public order. Were you in this report attempting to be even-handed as between the various interested parties? Were you reflecting the understandable anxiety of the Serb minority?
Oh, I was in this report attempting to be even-handed. We always attempt to be even-handed in our investigations.
We move to the end of this particular passage, which we find at the foot of page 8. Helsinki Watch does not dispute the authority of the duly constituted Croatian government in the interest of public safety to require that private arms be turned in or to collect reserve militia arms and to use appropriate steps under rule of law to enforce such orders. However, Helsinki Watch believes that excessive force was used by Croatian police in, for example, the village of Dvorna Uni. There is reason to believe that the intent was to intimidate the Serb population, as well as to bring about compliance with otherwise lawful orders to collect arms. And although the collection of arms was presented as part of a general program of public safety, at least in the early part of the collection program, the burden of the government orders appears to have fallen on Serb villages alone. Now, with that approach to the Serb minority problem, you turned, and we now don't need to deal with it at page 9, with what you saw in the village of Polat in Kosovo. At the foot of page 10, you called for a full investigation into that. And at the foot of page 12, the report concluded that Helsinki Watch urged that economic sanctions be used against the federal government of Yugoslavia and, when possible, against the government of Serbia, which is involved in egregious human rights abuses in the province of Kosovo. We also urge that the situation in other republics of Yugoslavia be carefully monitored, especially in Croatia, where there is a potentially explosive human rights situation, and that economic sanctions be applied in the future to any Yugoslav republic engaged in egregious human rights abuses. And that was your conclusion?
That was
Labour?
our position at that time.
And as you already explained, the report was widely disseminated, including to governments and embassies of the former Yugoslavia. If we now move on, please. The war erupted in mid to late 1991. Did your investigations continue?
Yes, it did.
Same approach and methodology, save that on the occasion of the next report, into which we will look in a second, you weren't one of the reporting officers yourself. You were the director commissioning the report
I
and
was
reviewing
the
it.
director of the organization. Our activities increased in 1991 because of the situation itself had become more volatile. We kept a permanent staff member on the ground during 1991, and we sent numerous missions. I would say it was hard to, they sort of interlapped with each other, but I would say perhaps 6 separate missions in the course of that year, and issued, I believe it was 7 newsletters and reports.
Interlocutors included people on the ground, ordinary villagers and inhabitants and so on. Did they also include representatives of government and the army?
Whenever possible, we did meet with government representatives. I believe that our staff in the field met on more than one occasion with Mr. Mesic, who was then the president of the presidency.
Before any report of Helsinki Watch would refer to abuse, what level of evidence did you regard as required?
The level of evidence depended, as I said before, mainly on getting numerous written testimonies that we wrote ourselves, taking oral testimonies from witnesses and, whenever possible, victims. Also investigating the crime scene itself and getting police reports and hospital reports and forensic evidence.
Would you like to put a title or label to the standard of proof that you would require before labeling something an abuse or not?
We are a professional organization. We have very high standards of proof. We've been doing this now for many years in 70 countries throughout the world. Our standards remain consistent throughout the organization, and our staff is well trained in taking testimony and not asking leading questions, in doing it in private, in avoiding any situations where the witnesses might be not speaking their own mind or exaggerating the facts.
Let's turn to tab 2, if we can just place the title page of that on the overhead projector. This is Yugoslavia, Human Rights Abuses in the Croatian Conflict, and it's dated September 91. I can deal with it shortly, but it's a preamble to what happened next when you attempted to put people on notice. If we look at the page number 3, in the general introduction and the top of page number 3, your report, not your report, the report for which you take general responsibility, reads like this at the top of the page: in many cases, there is evidence pointing to army complicity on the side of the Serbian insurgents. The JNA was authorized to act as a buffer between the two sides in order to prevent further bloodshed. However, the JNA, whose officer corps is predominantly Serbian and whose interests lie in the preservation of a Yugoslav state, has continued to intervene in the conflict, apparently without authorization from its civilian commander-in-chief, the Yugoslav presidency. These interventions have had the effect of preserving territorial gains made by the Serbs in Croatia. Now, that was the conclusion, and as you've explained to us, your staff included in their interlocutors people such as President Mesić and other government or army representatives.
That's correct.
Časni sudije,
Your
ja
Honors,
bih hteo samo toliko da
I
kažem
should
da
just like
ovdje
to
nije reč o
say
veštaku, ovo su upravo
that
stvari
this is not
o
an
kojima ćete vi
expert witness. These are
odlučivati i
things
o kojima
that
ćete vi
you
dati
will
zaključke.
have to
Mi smo ranije
judge
imali jednog
and draw
predstavnika ove
conclusions
organizacije
about.
i on
We
je
had
svedočio samo
earlier a
o stvarima
representative of
koje je
this
on direktno
organization,
video.
and he testified only
A
about things that he
zaključci ovakve
himself
vrste,
saw.
to je nešto što
However,
treba da bude
conclusions
u
of
vašoj
this
nadležnosti.
kind is something that is in your hands.
This witness is reporting rather than as an expert, reporting on what, as I understand it, she and her organization saw and heard. Now we'll have to hear the evidence on which these conclusions are based, and it will be for us to decide what weight to place upon them. Yes, Mr.
Ja samo smatram zaključke ne može da daje.
Was just saying that I don't think she should make conclusions.
She is producing a report and putting it in front of us. She's entitled, therefore, to give the evidence about it and to state what is in the report. Yes, Mr. Nice.
On page 3, in the center of the page, but the second paragraph under the heading Positions of Serbs and Croats, and the second sentence of that second paragraph, both sides stress that the current conflict is not an ethnic conflict, but the result of rabid nationalist activities by the opposite side. Each is willing to believe gruesome tales of atrocities committed by the other, but such stories can rarely be substantiated. The Serbian and Croatian press exaggerate and often misrepresent the news, exacerbating the fears of both Serbs and Croats. Apart from the fact that that was being represented to you by your staff, do you have any direct experience yourself of that sort of material, either at this stage or at a later stage?
I do remember being in Belgrade and seeing some very slick, well-produced propaganda material about Croatian abuses against Serbs, with horrendous photographs that it turned out were not from the current conflict at all, but from the fascist Croatian regime during World War II. There was a cover photograph of a man's head being severed by an axe, things of that kind, which of course would inflame and horrify people, and it was only when you read the small print that you saw that it wasn't actually happening at that time.
We pick up on page 3.
Nice. I'd just like to go back to the first passage on page 3 and to ask Ms. Labour to clarify the comment that the JNA apparently intervened in the conflict without authorization from its civilian commander-in-chief, the Yugoslav presidency. That's the first passage that you asked her to comment on. Could she clarify that for me?
The pattern of JNA intervention was reported over and over again to us. The Army would come in ostensibly as a buffer or to stop the violence, but we received numerous reports that it sided with the Serb nationalists and protected their interests. Where the I'm afraid I cannot tell you.
What I'm particularly interested in is the comment that they acted without authorization.
Yes, I can't.
Commander-in-Chief.
I cannot speak to where that information came from. It's in the report. It was somehow collected by our staff who prepared the report, but without going back to the people who wrote it, I cannot tell you where they got that information, whether it was told to them perhaps in their interviews with the presidency, because they did meet with representatives of the presidency, or whether it was their conclusion based on what they heard.
Page 3 starts the passage, the Serbian position, and if we turn over to page 4, only one point I really want to pick up on this passage. It's the last paragraph, 3/4 of the way down the page of this section. Politically, Serbs in Croatia and elsewhere call for the preservation of Yugoslavia as a strong federal state. The Serbs in Croatia have declared that they will secede from Croatia if Croatia secedes from Yugoslavia, and that they will take large areas of Croatia's land with them. The position of the Serbian insurgents is, if the Croats want to secede from Yugoslavia, good riddance to them. But if they succeed, they will not take one Serb or any land on which a Serb lives with them. Other Serbs have called for a greater Serbia, in quotation marks, which Serbia would rule all of present-day Yugoslavia except for Zagreb and its environs and Slovenia. This report then, September 1991, records some people using the phrase Greater Serbia. Was that your general experience at the time or not? Or you?
My impression is that this phrase was already in common usage. Many people talked about it. It was in the press, certainly in the Western press. And diplomats talked about it as well.
Turning to the Croatian position at the foot of page 4, many Croats believe that the current Serbian insurrection is the creation of the federal government in Belgrade, whose aim is to bring about the fall of the Croatian government and to reinstate Serbian and communist control over its territory. They believe that Slobodan Milosevic, the president of the Republic of Serbia, is manipulating the cause of human rights to achieve an imperialist goal. A frequently cited example is Kosovo, where the Serbian government justified its repression of the majority ethnic Albanian population and suspension of Albania's political rights on the basis of purported human rights abuses by Albanians against local Serbs and Montenegrins. Now, that passage, was that entirely the work of your staff? Do you have any personal views on it yourself?
Well, this passage really is explaining the attitudes that we heard. This is not our own position. This is an explanation of the political and intellectual climate that we found, both on the Serbian side, where we talk about the Serb position, and the Croat side, when we talk about what the Croats believed.
And then at the
This is all in terms of background, really.
Thank you. And then on the same topic, towards the foot of the page, the penultimate paragraph, conversely, many Croats consider the Serbian government of Slobodan Milosevic to be the real cause of the Serbian insurrection. Croats fear that Milosevic wants to preserve communist rule in Croatia and to create, in Yugoslavia, and to create a greater Serbia. And then you go on to give some more detail to that. Again, this is the reported views of your staff, the views reported to your staff. Now, I'm not going to go through the detail of any more because of limitations of time, and it's not necessary to do so. But if we go to the conclusions here on page 27, so that we can see what your organization's general view was before seeing what you did at the time yourself. The conclusion reads, the current conflict in Croatia between Croats, Serbs, and the Yugoslav army has resulted in many civilian deaths and human rights abuses. The majority of abuses committed by the Croats involve discrimination against Serbs. The Croats' beating of prisoners in police custody and their failure to rigorously prosecute a killing are also serious violations. The abuses committed by the Serbs involve physical maltreatment, including the beating and use of electric shocks against prisoners, and egregious abuses against civilians and medical personnel, including the use of human shields and taking of hostages. The Yugoslav army is also committing serious human rights violations by attacking civilian targets in coordination with the Serbian insurgents. Recent examples of such attacks occurred during the week of August the 19th, when the Yugoslav army indiscriminately attacked civilian targets in Osijek and Vukovar. The current conflict is spreading from the countryside to the major cities in Croatia, heightening concern that more civilians will be killed and more abuses will be committed. Helsinki Watch condemns such abuses and urges all sides to refrain from committing further violations of international humanitarian law, calls upon all parties to the conflict to respect their obligations under the Geneva Conventions. Was that indeed your organization's position at that time?
It is.
And what was your objective, so that we can understand what you did next? What was it your objective to achieve?
Well, I want to emphasize that at the time that these reports were being prepared, we had no notion that there would be an international tribunal or any indictments. We were trying to stop more killings before they occurred. and we were appealing to the governments that were in a position to do so and to international world opinion to become involved.
And so, we can turn to tab 3, please. Did you, in January, on indeed the 21st of January of 1992, send a letter to the accused and to General Adzic?
Yes, we did.
I should just remind us, if it be the case, that the previous report was circulated to embassies and governments as it was your general policy.
Previous report was also sent to the presidents of the various republics and to embassies and the press.
Well, now let's look at tab 3, the letter that was sent on the 21st of January to the accused and to General Adzic. And page 1 sets out the matter in mind. The Helsinki Watch Committee is deeply troubled by reports of serious human rights abuses by the Serbian government and the Yugoslav army. Our own investigations of these reports, conducted during a series of fact-finding missions to Yugoslavia over several years, indicate that many of these reports are well-founded. We call upon you to investigate the abuses enumerated in this letter and to punish those responsible for them. We call upon you to take immediate measures to ensure that such violations of human rights do not occur again. In the next paragraph, you summarize the abuses identified and the interference with basic human rights. And you end that by saying, finally, we object to the continuing persecution of the Albanian population in Kosovo. If we look at the form of the letter, rather than going through its detail, we see on page 2 the rules of war violations in the Croatian conflict, a reference to summary executions in the Croatian conflict. And then on page 3, you set out various particular incidents in Benkovac, Struga, Dal, Gračac, and then on page 4, in Pečki, Četekovac, Široka Kula, and on page 5, you set this out in the middle of the page. Reports by the news agency Tanjug accused Croats of having committed war crimes against Serbs in the areas near the town of Grubišno Polje in Croatia. The allegations were investigated by members of the European Community Monitoring Mission, who found that Serbian forces, not Croatian forces, were guilty of summary executions and destruction of civilian property in the area. The monitoring mission's report concludes, we have established evidence of crimes which were committed by the Serbian forces during the 2 or 3 month period that they controlled that particular zone of Western Slavonia. It goes on, dealing with more detail until we come to page 7, Vukovar. Where the allegation was put in these terms. The city of Vukovar was under constant siege by Serbian forces for 3 months. When the city fell on November the 18th, 15,000 people who had not fled the fighting emerged from the basements in which they lived for 12 weeks. After Vukovar's fall, civilians and soldiers hors de combat were beaten or arrested by Serbian paramilitary groups and the JNA. And on the basis of interviews with displaced persons from Vukovar and foreign journalists and humanitarian workers who visited Vukovar immediately after its fall, Helsinki Watch has reason to believe that many Croatian men, both civilians and combatants who laid down their arms, were summarily executed by Serbian forces after Vukovar's fall. On the same page, the letter dealt with Škabrnje in some detail. We can go over then to following pages, which are at page 9 we have Hum and Vochin. Page 11, Bruschka. Then a subheading of court martial and execution, torture and mistreatment in detention. And at page 13, under disappearances, a further reference to Vukovar, where you deal in particular with the denial of ICRC access to the Vukovar hospital and to other matters believed to have happened in the hospital at that time. On page 14, you touch on Zadar. Page 15, Obrovats and Dal. You turn to hostages. We can go on perhaps to 17. You deal with robbery. On 18, perhaps pause there on page 18 under forced displacements and resettlement. Helsinki Watch is concerned that Croats, Hungarians, Czechs and others are being forced by the Serbian rebels from their homes in Serbian-occupied territory in order to create purely Serbian regions in areas that are otherwise of mixed population. We are concerned that this non-Serbian population is being discriminated against and being forcibly displaced on the illegal grounds of ethnic origin. We are also concerned that displaced Serbs are being resettled in Serb-occupied territory in Croatia to consolidate Serbian control over regions captured from Croats and prevent the original non-Serbian inhabitants from returning. You then set out some figures, but that's the general allegation. On page 19, you dealt with killing, assault and harassment of journalists. Page 21, with forced mobilization. And on page 23, amongst other topics, you dealt with press restrictions, but at the foot of page 23, you returned to Kosovo. The Serbian misdemeanor law, which allows for up to 60 days imprisonment, has been grossly abused by Serbian authorities in Kosovo. Instead of prolonged detention, ethnic Albanians are being imprisoned several times for short periods. Many Albanians arrested for committing so-called verbal crimes, such as insulting the socialist, patriotic, national and moral feelings of the citizenry, insulting a public official, institution or organization, and conveying disturbing news. In many cases, Albanians are charged with such crimes for their support of Albanian nationalism, of independence from Serbia, and of republic status for Kosovo or union with Albania. Those convicted are usually given 30 to 60-day prison sentences, and by the time an appeal is filed and a hearing is granted, an individual has already served his or her prison term. And you go on to say that many have suffered multiple such sentences. Page 24, you make reference to the banning of the only Albanian language newspaper, Relindia. And on page 25, you summarize the position in this way: Dear President Milosevic and General Adzic, this lengthy letter contains only a portion of the information on human rights abuses compiled by Helsinki Watch. We urgently call on you to end these violations. We call upon the Yugoslav army and Serbian forces in Croatia, and you then set out a list of things you call on them to do: investigating reports, refraining from actions, releasing hostages, giving the location of missing persons, stopping robbery and pillaging, stopping the forcible displacement of people from non-war related reasons, refraining from mobilizing members of the anti-war movement, refraining from interfering with freedom of Serbian press, and you call on the Serbian government to investigate reports of harassment, to drop all charges against Vuk Druskovic and to cease harassment of journalists. That letter was sent, was it? Did you send that letter?
We delivered
Or did
that
you
letter
deliver it?
personally,
It may be to that we can turn if it's convenient after the break.
or I should say we attempted to deliver it directly to President Milosevic, but and to General Azic, but we were unsuccessful in actually seeing them, although we did meet with members of their government.
We're going to adjourn now for 20 minutes. Ms. LeBeau, please remember not to speak to anybody during the adjournment about your evidence until it's over.
Thank you.
Yes.
All rise for your vulvae. Please be seated.
Yes, Mr. Knight.
Letter just been considering tab 3, exhibit 359. Apologies. The letter that we've just been considering, exhibit 359 tab 3, was addressed not only to the accused but also to Adzic. Why to him?
Because we felt that he was also a responsible party to the abuses that we were detailing in our letter.
Addressed then to the accused but not to the federal authorities for the reasons you've already given. The effort you made to have it delivered, describe that for us, please.
I went to Belgrade, accompanied by Jonathan Fountain, who was then the chairman of the division of Human Rights Watch. We made serious efforts to reach President Milosevic and deliver the letter in person, including appeals that were made by the then U.S. Ambassador Warren Zimmerman, who also tried to use his offices to effect a meeting for us. We spent a lot of time waiting, as I recall, in a number of official buildings before we were finally given an audience with actually 2 separate meetings with members of the Ministry and also of Foreign Affairs and also members of the Army, and in 2 separate meetings, which I believe are detailed in my notes and in my witness statement.
Yes, Your Honour, this picks up at page 10 of the witness statement, and for one purpose we'll go to the notes, which are at tab 4 of Exhibit 359, although they're best viewed turning the binder round sideways, I'm afraid. If we turn to the first meeting with Pujic, and if you have any inability to remember who he is, his role is given in the first page of your handwritten notes on tab 4. We needn't display these on the overhead projector at the moment. He was, I think, will you tell us what position Pujic had?
I'm sorry, I don't quite hear what you're saying.
What position did Pujic hold, General Pujic?
In my notes I have here that he was in charge of civil defense.
And the other man who you met on that occasion was Petkovic?
Petkovic, an assistant in the legal department, and Lieutenant General Vojvodich, head of the medical services. These are not, I think, their formal titles, but the way in which they described their activities.
In the course of the discussion with them, did you hand over the letter that we've been reviewing?
Yes, we did.
In the course of those discussions, did they, or one or other of them, have something to say about Mesic and Markovic? You remember? It doesn't matter if you don't.
I have here in my notes that they claim that Mr. Mesic and Mr. Markovic were lackeys of the European community and eager to dissolve Yugoslavia.
Your Honours, to summarize the notes, which are in handwriting, the Chamber may actually find it easier to follow page 11 of the witness statement, for all purposes bar one. And Ms. Labour, was their reaction to what you were saying, and indeed to the letter, summarized in this way, that the Croats organized terror against Serb populations, that it was the Croats who used propaganda, that there were no paramilitaries under the Yugoslav army, that the army would investigate any crime brought to its attention, that the army was there as a buffer to protect Serbs from genocide, that Croatian paramilitaries were removing a third of the population. You were then given two examples where the JNA had charged individuals for crimes. You were told that 300,000 Serbs had fled, of which 160,000 were in Serbia. In discussions about Vukovar, you were told that Croatian soldiers were disguised as doctors. You were told that the army is searching for the was searching for the disappeared in an organized way. You were told that in Dubrovnik, and we didn't look at the passage in the letter, but there was a specific complaint about Dubrovnik in the letter. You were told that in Dubrovnik, the army had used heavy weapons, but so had the Croats. And it was asserted that the Croats had received arms from Germany. Were those some of the matters that were said to you in the course of this meeting?
Yes, these were, this is, I think, a very accurate representation of what appears in my notes.
There's only one additional point, that if you turn to the very last page of your notes, which has got a handwritten 35 on the top right-hand corner, and the judges will be able to follow this as the last entry. Is there an entry in relation to Kosovo which reads as follows? And perhaps you'd be good enough to read it for me, because although I think I can read it, it's better to come from you as it's your hand. Starting, increased presence of police.
Is this on what's page 36 of my notes?
Should be, I think, 35.
35, sorry.
The bottom right-hand corner.
Oh, yes. Yes, I was told that the increased presence of the police in Kosovo was the decision of the federal government, which saw the possibility of civil war there. I'm not quite sure which of whoever was speaking to me at the time said, I'm personally against such measures, but it's keeping the peace, implying that the situation there was not a good one.
How did that meeting end? With any resolution, and amicably or not, or with the promise of anything to come?
We ended the meeting asking them to read in detail. Of course, they had not had a chance to at that point. The abuses that were documented in our lengthy letter, and to get back to us with their response.
You then had another meeting, as you've already told us, With whom was that?
We also met with representatives of the Foreign Ministry.
You remember their names at this stage?
It's in my witness statement. I don't have it in front of me.
Well, if I can remind you from the witness statement, if that's acceptable to the Chamber, was one Dr. Micunovic,
Yeah.
and the second one, I have the statement, it's on page 11, in the middle of the page.
Yes, of course, it was with a Dr. Micunovic and a certain Mr. Kostunica. Kostunica, I guess you would pronounce it.
Do you know one way or another if there's any connection with the... No, perhaps not. Let's move on, but before I do, the Chamber will appreciate that in the statement, various passages of the letter, some the same as, some different from those that I have identified, are set out. It didn't seem to me helpful to duplicate material that you will have seen elsewhere summarized. Safe to say, as I have just done, that in the letter you dealt specifically not only with Vukovar and Osijek, but also with Dubrovnik, I think. Is that correct? Ms. Labour? You dealt also with Dubrovnik in the letter.
Yes, we did.
Very well. When you returned from these meetings, did you publicize your conclusions?
The letter was released to the press in Belgrade as well as in the United States, and it was very, my recollection is that it was very widely covered, I believe in Borba, and I remember the London Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and probably a number of other wire services and so forth. We met individually with certain correspondents in Belgrade, and we also held a press conference there, which was very well attended, and which we released the contents of the letter. And also told the press that we were releasing a similar letter in a very short time to the President of Croatia.
In case it hasn't yet been covered in evidence, the political or philosophical orientation of the paper Borba, do you know what that was?
I believe it was the official newspaper of the government of Serbia.
Let's move on then to the next event. Did you receive reports in New York of the execution of Croatian prisoners in Bač in Vojvodina?
Yes, we did.
Turn now to tab 5 with the usher's assistance. And we'll just place the letter concerned on the overhead projector. Did this lead to your sending a letter dated the 4th of February?
That's correct.
To the same two addressees, the accused and Adzic, the acting Minister of Defense and Chief of Staff? And did that letter read as follows, if you've got it there in tab 5? Helsinki Watch has received reports that 8 Croatian prisoners were executed in Bač, Vojvodina several days ago, and that 5 individuals were to have been executed at 1800 on February the 3rd. We respectfully request that you investigate and respond to such reports as soon as possible. Insofar as such reports are accurate, we call upon the Serbian government and the Yugoslav People's Army to cease immediately all extrajudicial executions of prisoners and to punish those responsible for such acts, particularly concerned about the fate of those who were arrested and remain missing from Vukovar. International law strictly forbids the summary execution, mutilation or torture of civilians and disarmed combatants, including prisoners. Helsinki Watch has documented 14 cases in which Serbian paramilitary groups and Yugoslav army officers have summarily executed over 200 civilians and disarmed combatants. We've documented other incidents of human rights violations by Serbian and Yugoslav forces in a letter which was delivered to you in January the 23rd. We await your response and urge you to respect your obligations under international law. So that letter went on its own account and also as a reminder of the previous letter. Were you ever in a position one way or another to confirm or reject the allegations that lay behind that letter, the allegations of execution?
Well, we did not these were allegations that we did not personally have the ability to confirm. We hope to receive some response from the addressees of this letter, which we also copied to the people we had met in our previous meeting, but we did not receive a specific response to it.
However, did you in due course receive a response? You can find it on tab 6 in a particular format, but the Chamber may find it easier to read on page 12 of the witness statement, where it's set out in full. And what we're looking at, Ms. Labour, on tab 6 is the copy of a letter sent to you and which was published in a newspaper, and it just is unfortunate that the original version has not been retrieved or may indeed have been mislaid
Apparently.
from your offices.
We cannot find it, yes.
The letter comes from someone called Goran Milinovic, of whom we've already heard something, the chef de cabinet of the accused. And it's dated the 11th of February, and it reads, "Concerning the letter sent to the President of the Republic of Serbia, Mr. Slobodan Milosevic, by the US Helsinki Watch Committee on January the 21st, we want to inform you as follows. The places in which the mentioned crimes were committed are not within the territory of the Republic of Serbia. Therefore, the Republic is not competent for, nor involved in such acts in any way. Consequently, the Republic of Serbia cannot be responsible for that. The President of the Republic of Serbia asked the competent organs of the Republic of Serbia to investigate the abuses enumerated in your letter, and if any of the citizens of the Republic of Serbia participated in those crimes, they will be brought to justice." What did this letter reveal to you by way of receipt of your letter and the authority of the accused?
Well, first of all, it revealed that the letter had been received and it was a response. Secondly, it said that the Republic of Serbia would take responsibility for any crimes committed by its citizens in any of the territories of the Federal Republic.
Before I move on to the next document that acknowledges receipt of your letter, there's something I meant to do just before the last passage of evidence in order that things can be dealt with chronologically. And if the Chamber would be good enough, and if you would be good enough to go to tab 9, in February of 1992, and indeed on the 13th of February, did you send a letter to President Tudjman? So in fact, I'm completely right chronologically, but nor by good fortune. It immediately follows Goran Milinovic's reply. Tab 9 is the letter you sent to the President of Croatia, the late President Tudjman.
That is correct.
And the Chamber can find reference to this in the witness statement, if it wishes to, at page 14. I'm not going to deal with the letter at great length at all, for obvious reasons. But if we can see from the way the letter is phrased on the first page, where he is addressed, "Dear President Tudjman, the Helsinki Watch Committee is deeply concerned by reports of serious human rights abuses by forces responsible to the Croatian government and by individual extremists in Croatia. Our own investigations of these reports, conducted during a series of fact-finding missions to Croatia in the past year, indicate that many of these reports are well-founded. We call upon you to investigate the abuses enumerated in this letter and to punish those responsible for them. You then, going to page 2, you can display all this swiftly so that people may see it. You deal with summary executions of civilians, and you identify Karlovats, and you put some names to the victims. On page 4, you turn to Gospic. On 6, to Marino Shello in Pakrac, and again identifying deaths. And so on. The letter concludes on page 44 and 45 with, at 44, you're welcoming the Croatian government's efforts to investigate reports of human rights abuses. And page 46, or 45 and 46, what you were calling upon the Croatian government to do. So in this letter, in some ways mirroring the letter to the accused, were you pursuing Helsinki Watch's practice of being even-handed and addressing all human rights abuses you found?
We most definitely were.
On this occasion, although you weren't present yourself, was it possible for your staff member to meet the President?
2 members of our staff did meet with President Tudjman and delivered the letter in person, also with other members of his government.
And with what protestations by him or his government as to future action?
They said that they would look into the abuses that we detailed, and in fact, I believe they made specific efforts in the Karlovac case and also in Gospic, not to our complete satisfaction, but at least some effort was made to find the people guilty of the crimes and to prosecute them.
Let's return chronologically to your dialogue insofar as it was with Serbia and the accused. Tab 7, please. Did you receive from the Republic of Serbia a long letter, tab 7, dated the 18th of March, 1992?
Yes, we did.
Again, I'm simply not even going to think of going through all of it or anything like, but we can see its general shape. Before we do that, let's see by whom it was signed. On the last page, page 25, it's the Deputy Prime Minister who provided it. Is that correct?
That is correct.
First page, which can perhaps go on the overhead projector, addressed to your premises in New York, says, we would like to make the following comments on your report, which alleges serious human rights abuses by the Serbian government. Was this, as you understood it, the letter that you had delivered in the way you've described?
Yes, it was.
While welcoming in principle, the letter says, the endeavour by Helsinki Watch to establish the truth about the reported violations of the laws of war and humanitarian law, to which the government of the Republic of Serbia wishes to make its contribution, we must at the same time express surprise that you consider the government of the Republic of Serbia to be responsible for such abuses in the Croatian conflict. There are no grounds for your allegations because the military operations in Croatia were conducted by members of the regular Yugoslav People's Army and by the local Serbian population. who were compelled by the actions of Croatia's secessionist government to take up arms in self-defense. As you have been told during your stay in Belgrade, the government of the Republic of Serbia has not been involved in any way in organizing volunteer units, not in the territory of the Republic of Serbia, and certainly not in the territory of Croatia. Pausing there, this twin defense, that it was another military body, nothing to do with Serbia, and or that there was no crimes because they were compelled to act by a dint of Croatia's secessionist government's moves, were those things you necessarily ever accepted?
These were, your question is, were these in,
Were these defenses to your letter things you accepted or not?
oh, no, we did not accept them. The letter does take up many of the points in our letter and, of course, expresses the Serbian government's position.
Yes. And we'll just,
Our impression at the time was that the Yugoslav army did not operate without the cooperation, let's put it in the collaboration of the Serbian government, in particular of President Milosevic. And that its role, as it says itself in many places, was there to defend the Serb minority, not to keep the peace.
just look at a few passages on the long letter, again it being available for reading in full by the parties and by the Chamber, should it so decide. On page 2, and the page numbers are at the top of these pages, and what is paragraph 3, we see this assertion by the writer that there can be no doubt that the prevention of violations of humanitarian law is a sacred duty and obligation incumbent upon every honest person, and particularly upon members of the armed forces. It then goes on to say how war crimes are wholly inexcusable. Over the page to page 3, under paragraph 4, one would expect an international organization with such a high reputation and experience as Helsinki Watch to be aware of this, assuming that the intention with which this report was compiled was to assign responsibility for abuses and to prevent future violation of humanitarian law. We cannot help but be surprised by the manner in which the report has been drawn up. The report casts some allegations that cast serious doubt on the motives of those who prepared it. So that gives something of the drift of the report. If you could turn to page 5. Dealing with Vukovar, and just part of the way it deals with Vukovar. It says halfway down page 5, picking it up in the center of a paragraph, to save time, it is quite another matter that perfectly healthy individuals, some of whom were even armed, were discovered among the sick and wounded in the Vukovar hospital, where they certainly had no right to be. The claim that more than 200 members of the hospital staff were captured and removed to Serbian detention centers is just as unfounded. All the personnel from the Vukovar hospital, except for the minimum number needed to care for the sick, were transported at their own wish to Croatia with a group of 5,000 citizens of Vukovar after the liberation of Vukovar by the Yugoslav People's Army. The list of names of persons described by the Croatian side as hospital staff contained individuals who have never been anything of the kind. Carlo Kruk, one of the directors of the VULP company of Vukovar, took refuge in the Vukovar hospital and disguised himself as a hospital employee with the intention of concealing his identity. Then if we move just to get the shape of the denial letter to page 7. The first fresh paragraph deals with alleged human rights in Vojvodina, and then goes on to assert that ethnic Hungarians had full rights. And if we go on to page 10, turning to Kosovo at the foot of page 10, the last paragraph on page 10, the Constitution of the Republic of Serbia guarantees the autonomous province of Kosovo and Metohija a form of territorial autonomy in keeping with the special ethnic, historical, cultural and other attributes of that region. By the same token, the Serbian constitution, the Republic's highest instrument, ensures the citizens of Kosovo and Metohija the right, through their representative bodies, the provincial parliament and provincial government, to administer matters having to do with economic development and financing, culture, education, the use of language, health, etc. Then goes on to deal with the asserted position of Albanians in Kosovo generally, and at such length that I won't read it out, but if we go to page 12, the second paragraph, the assertion, this brief review, page 12, second paragraph, thank you. This brief review clearly shows that the Albanian national minority has rights which far exceed accepted international standards. It was a long time before the domestic and foreign public finally realized that it is the plan for the secession of Kosovo and Metohija from Serbia that lies behind the dissatisfaction with ethnic Albanian national rights. And a couple more paragraphs, but if we go to page 13, again how things are expressed, the report completely overlooks the disloyalty of the ethnic Albanian minority to their home state of Serbia. It ignores the illegal nature of the activities and actions directed against the constitutional order and against the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Republic of Serbia. The illegal proclamation of an independent Republic of Kosovo receives no mention whatsoever in the report, even though it is a flagrant example of the impermissible abuse of minority rights for the purpose of achieving secessionist aims. The problems in Kosovo and Metohija can be attributed not to a failure to acknowledge human rights according to standards, but rather to the abuse of those rights and systematic refusal to exercise them. The purpose of such unconstitutional behavior is to make the ethnic Albanian minority appear the victim of alleged discrimination and persecution on the part of Serbia in order to win over the sympathy of a foreign public opinion for secessionist and separatist aims directed against the Republic of Serbia.
Mr. Nice, you know, this going back to Kosovo may not be very helpful at this stage in the proceeding.
Your Honour,
We're going back into the history of Kosovo, which we spent some time during the Kosovo phase of the trial, and in fact we were restricting, if you remember, the examination on that topic about events this far back.
Your Honour, yes, but of course it's always been our case that there is an integrated nature to the case as a whole, and that one topic and another are helpfully to be seen one beside the other. And with this witness, the witness has, of course, the experience of viewing all the relevant areas, well, not Bosnia, but the relevant areas of Croatia and Kosovo before the conflict. And it seemed to me that her views on and the material she received about Kosovo before the conflict would be of value to you. But I've come almost completely to the end of what I was going to say about Kosovo, apart from one particular passage, which I hope the Chamber would find of value at page 20. It is and it may be the only concession made in the letter. It's on page 20 at paragraph 11, where the writer refers to the allegations of abuses of the Serbian misdemeanor law and the so-called verbal crimes, saying that it should be recalled that the clause regulated the topic had been expunged, and then does say this: there were some mistakes made in Kosovo and Metohija, as mentioned in the report. This problem will be eliminated with the enforcement of uniform laws throughout the Republic. If we can then go, Ms. Labour, just to the conclusion of the letter, which we find on page 24. Notwithstanding, at the foot of the page, notwithstanding all the objections that could be made to the report, please rest assured that the competent judicial authorities will do everything in their power to do their duty and investigate the other allegations contained in the report, which at present, because of the well-known situation in Yugoslavia, cannot be reliably authenticated. We would like to mention for your information that in the meantime, a decision has been taken at the federal level on the creation, powers and composition of a commission to investigate war crimes and crimes of genocide perpetrated against the population of Serbia and other nationality during the armed conflict in Croatia and other parts of the country. And it assures you at the end of the Serbian government's intention to do everything to help. This letter, then, essentially what was it? A denial of the allegations that you had made?
Well, it was essentially a denial, but it also was an acceptance of responsibility and a commitment to look into the allegations we made, and also to establish its own humanitarian and war crimes commission.
And we saw that it was indeed critical of your body as well.
Sorry?
It was critical of your organisation.
It was certainly critical of our information, although it did not specifically criticize the organization.
Were there any consequences in the form of arrests made by the authorities pursuant to your lengthy and very detailed letter?
None that I know of. The main follow-up was the establishment of the State Commission on War and Genocide Crimes, which, well, I'm jumping ahead to your next exhibit, but I think this letter was the beginning of an attempt by the Serbian government, a public relations attempt to counter its bad image that it was getting from, not just from our criticisms, but criticisms that were appearing from other organizations and in the press at that time, and as was the establishment of this new commission.
Now, of course, this letter that we've seen comes from the Deputy Prime Minister. It's responsive to a letter that was quite specifically addressed to the accused and also to Adzic, and in respect of which you'd already received one reply from the chef de cabinet of the accused.
That is correct.
Let's now turn to the State Commission for War and Genocide Crimes, but briefly in tab 8, the last tab we need to consider, the only outstanding tab. We saw how the objectives of the Commission were identified in the previous letter. This letter comes September 1992 to you, and its setting can be understood in the first paragraph on the first page, first and second paragraphs. One, we've established since our letter, we informed you that the State Commission for War and Genocide Crimes has been established. We have not had contacts with Helsinki Watch. In my opinion, exchange of information between us would be mutually beneficial for the purpose of establishing the true facts. And a truthful account of genocide crimes in the area of Konjic, Herzegovina, to which I am referring herein, is an illustrative example. And the writer, who we can see in a few minutes' time, goes on to say, the Helsinki Watch report, War Crimes in Bosnia-Herzegovina, 12th of August 1992, which we haven't troubled the Chamber with, mentions among many other crimes that approximately 3,000 Serbian civilians were held hostage in a tunnel near Sarajevo by Bosnian forces in late May, near Konjic, noting that they have since been released. Now, the letter, is this right, Ms. Labour, goes on to deal with a view of the suffering of those Serbs in very great detail and with reference to evidence obtained.
That's correct. They are actually, in this letter, he's responding to yet another report of ours, which deals not with the conflict in Croatia, but at war crimes in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Right, yes, as I said, the report we haven't troubled the Chamber with. But
Right.
the point I want you to confirm is that this report, when it concerns suffering by Serbs, is detailed and appears to reflect the ability to talk to witnesses and so on.
That's correct.
Yes. And we see on the last page of the report how it's concluded. Perhaps the second to last page first, page 8. Foot of the page, last paragraph. I believe the facts given above can give Helsinki Watch a full picture of the factual situation regarding the crime of genocide in the Konjic area, then a narrative of the number allegedly killed and how. And then on the following page, page 9, we're at your disposal for additional explanations. This was an example to indicate the usefulness of mutual exchange. Please send me a copy of your findings on the destruction of Serb villages, an offer of the facts on West Slavonia, and then signed by the Secretary to the Commission, Dr. Milan Bulajic, and copied to the UN Secretary General, United States President, Special Rapporteur, and various ministers of the former Yugoslavia. You accepted, did you, throughout, that crimes were committed by all sides?
Did we accept that? Of course we did. But I note here that although this commission was set up to investigate crimes against all nationalities, the letter deals exclusively with crimes against the Serbs, people of Serbian nationality, and I had several further contacts with Dr. Bulajic. He came to visit me in my office in New York, and in January of 1992, I went to Belgrade and interviewed victims that his commission produced for us to see. They were women who had been raped by Croats or Muslims. I was doing an investigation of rape at that time in all of the areas, and the witnesses that I interviewed in Belgrade were all Serbs.
Finally, please, from the materials we've looked at and from your experience generally, what can you say about whether your reports on this general conflict were seen and reviewed, taken seriously and analysed by those in authority? What can you say about whether your reports were seen and reviewed by those in authority in the former Yugoslavia?
It seems to me that these reports were seen and reviewed, especially because we received these responses, these written responses. It's been my experience in general, because our work covered many other countries besides the former Yugoslavia, that even when we receive no response, the governments are listening.
And as to your allegations made against the accused in your letter and in your reports, did you ever receive any information to indicate that those complaints had been acted on in any serious way?
That it's been acted on, you
Whether
said?
they'd been acted on by the accused or those
We did not see any significant response to try to prevent future abuses from taking place or to punish those who were responsible for the ones that we documented.
Thank you very much.
You're
Wait there,
welcome.
you'll be asked some further questions.
Yes, Mr. Milosevic.
What happens now?
I think if it may be just as well if the exhibits stay with the witness, no doubt there are going to be questions about
I'm
it.
sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
It's all right, it was for the usher.
Right.
Yes,
Gospođo Leiber, na početku vašeg
Mrs.
iskaza
Leiber,
datog 4.
At the beginning
marta 2002.
of your statement and interview between the 4th and 7th of March 2002, you said that the witnesses and victims who gave statements to Human Rights Watch
to učinili u poverljivom
did
obliku
so confidentially,
I da podnošenjem
and
dokumenata
that
su preneti njihovi iskazi, vi
their
štitite
testimony
njihovu sigurnost.
was conveyed in the documents and that you were protecting their security. Is that right?
In many cases, that is correct.
U većini ili u svim slučajevima
In
koje
most cases, or in all the cases that you mention here? I will read out
vi napisali,
to you what you wrote here.
showing the interest of the safety of the victims and witnesses who have provided Helsinki Watch, now Human Rights Watch, with first-hand accounts of their victimization based on their experience and or observation. Majority of witnesses have given their testimonies in confidence. Jel' tako?
Is that right?
That is correct. It was our policy in order to, these people had experienced very traumatic events and were worried about their future safety, and we assured them that we would not use their names, although in many cases we had their names, we gave them pseudonyms.
Dobro, u vezi s tim, da li
In that
Human Rights
connection,
Watch ima podatke o
does
tim
Human Rights
navodnim
Watch
svedočima
have the
i žrtvama
data on these alleged victims and
što je još važnije, da li
witnesses?
je moguće s tim
And
licima
still
stupiti u
more
kontakt?
importantly, is it possible to get in touch with those people?
The data exists in our files. I think it would not be appropriate and probably also impossible at this point to get in touch with those victims.
A da li to znači da svaka
Does
mogućnost
that
dobijanja
mean
pojašnjenja i dopunskih
that any
informacija od
possibility
tih
of
lica je
obtaining clarifications and additional
na
information
taj način
from
onemogućena
those
i da li to
persons
znači da
is not possible?
ova ovdje
And does
institucija
that
treba da
mean
odlučuje
that
na
this
osnovu iskaza
institution
anonimnih
needs to
osoba?
decide and rule on the basis of statements given by anonymous persons?
that I think sounds like a matter of comment. You've heard what the witnesses said in answer to your questions, that it would not be appropriate and also impossible to get in touch with the victims. So that's her answer, and any conclusion to be drawn from that will be a matter for us. If you want to add anything,
Oh, I
Ms.
can
Labour,
just
of
add
course.
that there's been, as we all know, a tremendous movement of peoples within the territories that we're discussing Therefore, to just find the people that we interviewed would be probably a physical impossibility.
Mr. May, if it's not a question for the witness, then it's a question to you. Regardless of the fact that I consider you an illegal institution, do you professionally believe that you can decide on the basis of statements by anonymous persons?
A point you frequently make. No need to make it again. We've heard you say it so often. Now, as far as the evidence is concerned, you can ask the witness questions about her reports. Any conclusions we draw from the reports are matter for us. You will have your chance if you want to address us on it, what conclusions to draw. Now, ask the witness some questions if you want to.
Very well, but the question is, in fact, whether the witness believes, in view of the organization she belongs to, that this institution is unable to provide appropriate protection to alleged victims and witnesses and preserve the confidentiality of their statements.
That's not relevant. You've heard the answer which she's given, that it's not possible now. Now, we're dealing with reports. We have that in mind, so there's no need to labor the point. We're dealing with reports. If you want to ask the witness about them, you can. But the sources of them are not available.
Very well then please tell me, Ms. Leiber, who made the decision that the persons that you and your colleagues informed or received information from should remain anonymous? Or more precisely, is there a court ruling about that, or was that an initiative on your own part or the practice of your organization, a decision that you yourself took?
Mr. Milosevic, you should understand that when these reports were being compiled, we had no notion whatsoever that there would be a court, an indictment, or that our evidence would be used in testimony. We were trying to stop the killings that were taking place at that time. We were trying to elicit the cooperation of your government and the other governments involved to bring an end to this warfare and to the abuses that we documented. The witnesses that we interviewed at the time were in real danger. Many of them were refugees. They were in camps. They had no idea where their future would take them, whether they would be repatriated, taken out of the country, punished for what they said. They were frightened people, and the way to get them to talk was to assure them that their names would not be used.
We're talking about witnesses. As for the efforts of Serbia and my own personal efforts for the war to end and peace to be restored, they are well known, but that is not the subject of your testimony. My question is, if those alleged witnesses and victims are accessible, is it justifiable to violate the principle of directness of proceedings and having the possibility of those victims themselves and persons?
None of this is for the witness. This is for the court to determine. It's to do with the admissibility and weight of evidence. And it's a matter which we shall determine, as we have done. Now, you can ask the witness about her reports by all means, but ask a factual and concrete question rather than these speculations.
I'm asking Ms. Leiber precisely questions related to her work. Since the witness is aware of the principle of direct testimony.
No, Mr. Milosevic, we're wasting time here. If you want to continue with this examination, you must move on to questions which are relevant and admissible. So far, you haven't asked one. Now, let's move on.
pitanje je upravo to, gospodine May.
That is precisely the
Da li bi
question, Mr.
Human Rights
May.
Watch,
Would
gospođa Leiber je izvršni
Human
direktor,
Rights Watch, of which
zna
Ms. Leiber
politiku
is an
svoje
executive
organizacije,
director,
zna njene
she's familiar with the
kriterijume.
policies
Da
of
li bi
her
Human Rights
organization
Watch
and their
osudio
criteria,
takvu praksu
would Human Rights Watch
povrede,
condemn such a practice of
kršenja načela neposrednosti postupka?
violating the principle
drugim
of direct evidence in other proceedings, in other
No.
cases and situations?
Now, the question about hearsay evidence, that's a matter for us. Now, if you want to ask any questions, time is going, and if you don't ask relevant questions, you'll be stopped altogether.
Ja imam veoma mnogo pitanja,
I have
jer je ovde pokrenuto
very
veoma
many
mnogo tema.
questions because very
Gospodine
many
May, kao što
issues have been raised
ste
here,
svesni toga,
Mr. May, as you are well aware.
Gospođo Leiber, da li lično
Ms. Leiber,
dobro poznajete
do you personally
tu se pomenju Kenneth Anderson,
know
sa vama
well
koordinator
Kenneth
izveštaja iz
Anderson,
januara
who
91.
coordinated with you the report
Ivana
dated January
Nižić
91,
i
Ivan
Gemma Rohn,
Nižić
autori
and
izveštaja
Gemma
iz septembra
Rohn,
91.
the authors of the reports of September 91.
Yes, I do. I know them all quite well. They were all members of my staff.
A da li je Ivana Nižić
And
istražitelj ovog
Ivana
tužilaštva?
Nižić, is she an investigator of this office of the prosecutor?
She was not at the time that she worked for us.
Da li vam je poznato, da li je sad?
Do you know whether she is now?
She is not at this time either, but she did at some point serve as an investigator for the tribunal.
A dobro, a da li možemo da zaključimo
And can we then conclude
da vi ovde, pored iznošenja
that
podataka,
in addition
do
to
kojih ste sami
presenting
došli
facts that you
kroz
yourself
razgovore koje ste vi vodili,
established through interviews that you conducted,
iznosite i navode do
are
kojih su došli
also
lica koja
making
ne poznajete ili
assertions
ne
reached
poznajete
by
dobro.
persons you don't know well or you don't know
To
at
tako
all,
što su razgovarali sa trećim licima.
on the basis of their
Navodnim
conversations with
svjedocima i
third
žrtvama.
persons, alleged
Za nas ovdje
victims
nepoznatog
and
identiteta.
witnesses of unknown identity to us here.
Excuse me, but I don't understand who these persons I don't know well are. I just said that the three people who you mentioned by name are people who worked on the staff of Human Rights Watch. I personally recruited Mr. Anderson. He was a consultant to our organization. He worked with a very prominent law firm in New York City at the time. I hired Ivana Nišić when she had just finished her graduate studies at Columbia University and had worked for no one else before she came to work for Human Rights Watch. What she did after she left us is another story, but at the time that she worked for us, all of her experience was gained in our employ, and I personally trained her as an impartial and professional investigator of human rights abuses.
Vi ste, kako ste naveli,
As you
specijalista
said,
za
you
sovjetsko
were a
pitanje,
specialist
na tome ste se školovali.
for the Soviet
To je
Union.
Ruski institut
You were trained
na
as
Columbia
such.
univerzitetu.
That is the Russian
Šta su po
Institute at
zanimanju,
Columbia
odnosno po
University.
obrazovanju druga
What
lica koja su
were
radila
the
za
other
Human Rights
persons
Watch?
who worked for Human Rights Watch
Da li
in
ih sve
terms of their
poznate?
educational background? And do you know all of them?
Are you talking about the three people you named by name or the entire staff of Human Rights Watch?
Ne, pošto pretpostavljam da nisu samo
No,
ta tri
since
lica
I
učestvovala u
assume
svim
that
vašim
those three
izveštajima. Vi ste
persons
imali
were not the only
jednu
persons
prilično
involved in
široku
all your reports.
organizaciju,
You had
dakle,
quite a large
pretpostavljam
organization.
da ste
So
koristili
I
usluge i lica koje
assume
ne
you
poznajete.
use the services of persons that you didn't know as well.
No, I used the service. All the people who worked for me are people I knew and knew quite well. The staff of Human Rights Watch, which at this time is probably close to 200 people, but at that time was considerably smaller, consisted of regional specialists, people who knew the language and the political and cultural traditions of the country that they were dealing with. Many lawyers who were trained in international law and in techniques of investigation, and people with writing abilities and people with investigatory skills. These were the people we looked for when we hired people. This is what made up our staff. Everyone on our staff was someone I know. At the time that I was with the organization, I knew personally, and most of them I knew quite well.
Da li je svako od ovih navedenih lica
And
radilo kao
did
sudija
each of these
ili
mentioned
školovan za to
persons work as a
zvanje,
judge, or were
odnosno
they trained for that profession?
kvalifikovan
Were they
da
qualified
uzima iskaze u
to take
postupcima
statements in
koji se
legal
vode pred sudovima?
proceedings before courts?
These people were trained as investigators, not as judges. We trained them many of them had training in law school before they came to work for us, but everyone went through a training procedure within the organization. We made sure that they understood what was a violation of the laws of war, what were crimes against humanity, what sorts of things to look for when they were in the field, what techniques to use when they were interviewing witnesses, how to corroborate evidence, how to be impartial and look for crimes on all sides and not to just take one person's story as being the truth. And all of this was pretty much standardized. We had training sessions for people before they went out into the field, and we never sent anyone into the field who wasn't accompanied by someone new into the field who wasn't accompanied by someone who was professionally experienced.
Dobro, vi znate da po
But
zakonima u
you
vašoj
know,
zemlji
according
i
to the laws
proširenoj
in force
praksi u
in your
drugim
country
zemljama,
and well-established practice in other countries,
advokati i konsultanti ne uzimaju
attorneys and
iskaze.
consultants, counsel, do not take statements in proceedings.
Pa je moje pitanje u stvari
So
da
my
li,
question
da li
is,
Is the premise true? I never heard of any such statement. Don't know where you get it from, Mr. Milosevic. Attorneys take, well, we'll ask the witness. In your experience, Ms. Labour, do attorneys take statements from witnesses in the United States?
I believe that's their job.
Yes, next question.
A dobro, pošto se bavite ljudskim pravima,
since
pa
you're
prema
involved
tome znate
in
šta je
human
pravo na
rights,
pravičan sudski
so
postupak,
you
da li
know what the
možete
right to a fair
da kažete
trial
da bi bio
means.
pravičan postupak
Would you say that a fair trial would be one in which the authenticity of statements of alleged witnesses were to be assessed not by a court but by some third party? I'm sorry, the microphone has been switched off.
Mr. Milosevic, you are going back to the same questions. It's not for the witness to judge what is a fair trial and what isn't. It's for us. It's nothing to do with her evidence. Now, we have your point, and there's no need to go over it. These reports are based on the statements of persons who are not giving evidence. They are hearsay. You know quite well we admit hearsay here. As to the weight of it, it's for us to decide. Now, if you have no relevant questions for this witness, and it sounds as if you haven't, your examination will be stopped. Now, go on to some relevant matter which the witness can deal with rather than comment of this sort.
Dobro, sasvim konkretno pitanje.
All right, a
onda,
very concrete
da
question
li
then.
smatrate
Do you consider
dakle, da ste vi,
That you,
Kenneth Anderson,
Ivana Nižić, Jamela
u
Ron,
stanju da cenite valjanost iskaza narodnih
able
svedoka i žrtava
to
jednako
assess
kao
the statements of witnesses
sudije
and
legalnih
victims
sudova?
in the same way as judges of legal courts are able to
Je li to
do.
vaša ocjena?
Is that your assessment?
That was not our intent. We were not conducting a criminal trial when we assessed their statements. We were trying to determine the facts of a situation that was quite horrendous in which people were being killed. And we did the best we could to put that evidence together in a way that would be meaningful to the people responsible. My job was to take this evidence, bring it to the attention of government leaders such as yourself with a request that something be done to stop future crimes, as well as to punish the perpetrators of the crimes that we documented.
Dobro.
Very well. So therefore, you endeavored to draw attention to this, and this brings us to the letters that you commented a moment ago. You say that when you arrived, and this is contained in your own statement, when you arrived in the SFRY, in order to hand over the letter to me and Blagoje Agic, that you had meetings with people from the Federal Secretariat of Defense and representatives, as you yourself say, of the Ministry of External Affairs, and you also state that you were received by Dr. Micunovic, Mr. Koštunica, and that they presented the same official stands as the representatives of the Federal Secretariat for National Defense had done, for which you yourself say were firm, and they put forth some preliminary denials with respect to the fact that the army did not support the paramilitary units. Is that what you said in your statement? Words to that effect?
Yes, it was.
Do you know that what you set out in your statement, and you say with the representatives of the Serbian Foreign Ministry, and then go on to enumerate those persons, and say that Koštunica, who is now the President of the Republic, and Dr. Micunovic, the President of Parliament in Yugoslavia?
I'm not certain that these were the same people, although the names are the same. I don't have first names for either of them.
Well, at the time there were no others. They were deputies, members of parliament, but not the representatives of the ministries, or rather the Foreign Affairs Ministry.
Are you telling me that they misrepresented themselves when I met with them?
No, I'm not saying that they misrepresented themselves. I don't believe that they would do anything like that. They were deputies in the parliament, that's true, about Koštunica and Micunovic. I don't think you understood who you were dealing with. That is why I say that what you present here in your statement need not be necessarily correct. Because, for instance, this is, how shall I put it, these are very ordinary facts that you represent in a way that is incorrect, because neither Koštunica nor Micunovic represented the foreign ministry. They were just popular deputies, and in the opposition party at the time, at that, the Democratic Party, in fact. And they were all together there in that same party, Micunovic and Koštunica, members of the same party at the time. So I'm not saying that they misrepresented themselves. They would not do so. They would have no reason to do so. But what I'm saying is perhaps that you misunderstood them and their position. And that is why I am asking you whether you allow for the possibility that you understood certain things incorrectly.
Let the witness answer. Let the witness answer this. First of all, is your assertion about the position of these two gentlemen, and then there's the more general point.
Well, what their actual position in the government or the party was at that time may not have been clear to me, but what they said is very clear to me, and what they said appears in my witness statement and in the attached documents. That it doesn't change in one way or another what they said, nor did what they say in any way contradict the general views of the government at that time, the Serbian government.
Da, samo vi ste
Yes,
upravo rekli da su vam
but you
oni
said
izneli
precisely
identične
that they
stavove
put forward identical
kao što ste ih
stands,
čuli u
the same ones that you heard,
pre toga
the ones you heard previously,
imate u ovoj izjavi
and that is
generalštabu,
contained in the General Staff
ste
report,
razgovarali sa
where you
General
talked to
Purićem.
General Purić,
a radi se
and then
o činjenici
we're dealing with the fact, which I assume you know, at least now that you do, that they were the opposition party, that is to say, adversaries to my policy, and that after takeover of power in the year 2000, it was they who illegally handed me over to The Hague here. So if they told you the same thing that...
No, Mr. Milosevic, that's nothing to do with the witness. Now, what's the point?
su dakle predstavnici
If they, therefore, were the representatives of the opposition, prominent representatives, precisely those men who are in power now and who sent me here illegally and unlawfully, at that time...
I'm going to stop you till you ask a proper question. Now, what is your question?
S obzirom da ste
In view of the
imali
fact that
identičan
you
odgovor od
had
njih,
an
onakav
identical
kakav ste
answer
dobili
from them, the
i od
kind of
generala
answer that you
Purića, koga
received from General
pominjete,
Purić that you mention as
da
well.
li je to
Now, is
kada
that,
se ima u vidu
when
da
we
su
bear
oni
all this in
predstavnici
mind, the fact
opozicione
that they are
partije,
representatives of
a
the
dali vam
opposition
isti
party
odgovor,
and gave
za
you the
vas
same
dovoljan
answer, is
dokaz
that sufficient proof and evidence for
da se
you
radilo o jednoj
that
istinitoj
it
tvrdnji,
was a
jer iz
true
dve
assertion that was being made because
pozicije
it was being
dobijate
made
isti
from
odgovor.
two different
To vas
opposing
pitam, s obzirom da
positions?
se vi
You got
bavite
one and the same answer from two
istraživanjem
different
činjenica
sides. And I'm
i
asking you this because you are
imate
researching the
cilj, kako
facts, and
kažete,
your
da
objective
otkrijete
is, as
istinu.
you say, to uncover the truth.
I understand what you're saying now. I don't think that the fact that both parties agree in representing the official Serbian government's position does not in any way change the evidence that we collected on the ground. I fail to see. I mean, this is an interesting issue for you that there was agreement on that. It also explains a few of the comments that were made that were not totally within the party line about Mr. Message and about being hand in hand with the. Well, anyway, there were comments that were a little confusing there, but in general, the fact that the Serbian government took a unified front on these issues does not change in any way the evidence that we collected, nor does it indicate that any efforts were made to investigate the crimes that we documented.
Dobro, gospođo Leiber.
All right, Mrs. Leiber, tell me this.
Da li je to logična greška
Is it
koju
a
ste
logical
napravili
error,
kada ste
this one that you
razgovarali
made
sa
when you
dvojicom
talked to
političara i
two
dobili iste
politicians
odgovore,
and
da ste ih
received the
odmah
same answers, that you ranked them straight
No,
away as being
I'm-
representatives of?
I'm going to stop this. This is your own case which you're trying to argue with the witness. No error, except one you claim to detect. And it seems to me we've finished this point. Let us move on to another one. We've exhausted the topic. Yes, Mr. Trbuskovic, now what have you got to add?
Your Honours, if I may just explain, I think there's a slip of the tongue here. What we're talking about is that possibly there was an error made along the lines that the witness thought that it was she was dealing with representatives of power and authority. They were just deputies and did not represent the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's how I understood it, and that's where the mistake lay. So she thought she was talking to representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whereas they were not representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the time, and that is where this misunderstanding lies, the roots of it.
Mr. Trbuskovic, we've heard that. We understood it. Now let us move on to a new point. Time is limited. No point going over the same ground over and over again. We have the point about these meetings now. Mr. Milosevic, yes, 5 minutes before the break. Move on to something else.
Well, as we're dealing with such a cardinal mistake, if I can put it that way, one that has been noted, do you allow for the fact that this does not correspond to the actual state of affairs, the picture that you wish to paint about the higher standards of exactitude in the work of your organization?
Ms. Labour, if you don't wish to respond to that, it seems to me a totally pointless point, which the accused is trying to blow up. Now, if you wish to respond about accuracy, of course you can.
I will certainly stand by the accuracy of my organization and its investigations, and if anything that we brought to your attention was inaccurate, it was your position to show where our inaccuracies lay. Getting the title or the political position of people we spoke to in your government incorrect. Presumably we met with them in the foreign ministry. I recall that, therefore we assume that they were members of the foreign ministry. I don't think it's a very significant point, especially because they said nothing of great significance that changed anything that had been told to us by the other people we met with.
Very well, Ms. Labour. Now you received an answer, a response sent to you by my chef de cabinet, Goran Milinovic, and you quoted it here. I don't know whether you quoted the entire letter or the excerpts from the letter. I'm not going to look for the letter now, but what you quoted was sufficient. You say, in connection with the letter sent to the President by the American Helsinki Watch Committee, etc., we inform you of the following. First of all, the places in which the mentioned crimes took place. And in your extensive letter, you go on to enumerate all sorts of examples and all sorts of different places from your letter. They are not on the territory of the Republic of Serbia. The Republic of Serbia, therefore, is not competent nor involved in any of this procedure. The Republic of Serbia, therefore, cannot be responsible. And the second point, the President of the Republic of Serbia has called on the competent authorities in the Republic of Serbia to investigate the abuses mentioned and set out in your letter. And if any citizen of the Republic of Serbia was the perpetrator of a crime, he will be taken to trial. And this is then signed by my chef de cabinet who sent you this response. Ms. Labour, do you know that in Serbia, already at the end of 1992, people were tried for war crimes, individuals were tried, and they were citizens of Serbia and had perpetrated these crimes on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example. Are you aware of that?
I believe we're dealing with the situation in Croatia in this discussion.
I'm talking about practice now. In practice, the organs, court organs, the executive power and institutions considered that if a citizen of Serbia were the perpetrator of the crime, a crime, regardless of which laws they fall under, if they're crimes and laws which were held in Serbia, they must be held accountable. So do you know that these people were tried for all crimes in 1992, as early on as 1992, although there was no war in Serbia at that time. But the organs, respective organs, did come by information that certain citizens had perpetrated crimes, and they were taken to court, brought to trial. Do you know about that? Are you aware of that? If you don't know about it, just say you don't know and we can move on.
I don't have any specific information about that at this point. I believe that we were talking in this letter about paramilitary forces that came from Serbia